Did Hollywood ever truly understand Vietnam, or did it turn one of America's most painful wars into nightmare entertainment? Some of these films were praised as masterpieces. Others were accused of being too brutal, too political, or too uncomfortable to watch twice. But the best Vietnam War movies did something rare. They made audiences feel the fear, confusion, guilt, and madness behind the battlefield. And by number one film may still divide viewers more than any other. Hamburger Hill, 1987. A hill with no civilians, no city, and no obvious victory became one of the most exhausting symbols of the Vietnam War. Hamburger Hill does not try to make battle look poetic. It throws the viewer into mud, heat, confusion, and command decisions that feel brutally disconnected from the men actually climbing toward death. The film follows soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division as they fight to capture Hill 937 in 1969, a real battle that became controversial because of the heavy casualties and the question many Americans asked afterward. What was it all for? That question gives the film its quiet power. The soldiers are not shown as legends. They are tired, angry, scared, loyal, and sometimes broken before the next assault even begins. What makes Hamburger Hill so gripping is its refusal to turn war into a clean, heroic mission. Every push uphill feels like the same nightmare repeating, and that repetition becomes the point. It captures the grinding, punishing reality of a war where victory could feel meaningless minutes after it was won. As a Vietnam War film, it may not be the flashiest, but it is one of the rawest. Rescue Dawn, 2006. Survival does not always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like hunger, insects, silence, and one man refusing to disappear. Rescue Dawn takes the Vietnam War away from the crowded battlefield and drops it into a different kind of nightmare, the jungle prison. Directed by Werner Herzog, the film follows Dieter Dengler, a U.S. Navy pilot shot down during a mission over Laos and captured by enemy forces. Christian Bale plays him with a strange mix of optimism and desperation, making Dengler feel less like an action hero and more like a man clinging to sanity by pure instinct. What makes the film stand out is its focus on endurance rather than spectacle. The war is always present, but it is felt through captivity, isolation, starvation, and the terrifying size of the jungle itself. Herzog had already explored Dengler's story in documentary form, and here he turns it into a tense physical survival drama. Rescue Dawn earns its place because it shows another hidden corner of the Vietnam conflict. Not the famous battles, but the human will tested far beyond normal limits. It is not the loudest Vietnam movie, but its quiet suffering stays with you. Casualties of War, 1989. Some Vietnam War films show men losing battles. Casualties of War shows something even darker, men losing their moral center. Brian De Palma's film is not built around a famous military victory or a grand battlefield objective. It focuses on a horrifying crime committed by American soldiers against a Vietnamese civilian woman and the terrible pressure placed on the one man who refuses to stay silent. Michael J. Fox plays Private Erickson, a soldier trapped inside a squad where obedience, fear, and group loyalty become more dangerous than enemy fire. Sean Penn's Sergeant Meserve is charismatic in the worst possible way, the kind of leader whose authority turns cruelty into permission. What makes the film so disturbing is that the war itself becomes a moral fog, a place where men tell themselves that anything can be excused because everything already feels broken. The movie is tense because Erickson's enemy is not only outside the unit, it is inside his own patrol. Every scene asks a brutal question. When the uniform protects wrongdoing, who has the courage to resist? Casualties of War is not comfortable entertainment, and that is exactly why it matters. It reminds viewers that the true horror of war is not only what soldiers survive, but what some are capable of becoming. We Were Soldiers, 2002. Before Vietnam became a national wound, it was already a battlefield of confusion, courage, and impossible decisions. We Were Soldiers takes viewers back to the Battle of Ia Drang, one of the first major direct clashes between U.S. forces and the North Vietnamese Army. Mel Gibson plays Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, a commander leading his men into a valley that quickly becomes a deadly trap. The film stands out because it does not treat the battle like a simple action sequence. It shows the terror of helicopters landing under fire, soldiers trying to hold their lines, medics running into chaos, and families back home waiting for news that might destroy them. Its emotional power comes from the contrast between military discipline and human vulnerability. These men are trained, armed, and ordered forward, but they are also young, frightened, and painfully mortal. The film also gives attention to the North Vietnamese side, which adds weight to the battle instead of turning it into a one-sided spectacle. Some critics found it more traditional and heroic than darker Vietnam films, but that is also its strength. We Were Soldiers honors bravery without pretending war is clean. It is loud, emotional, and deeply patriotic, but underneath the courage is a terrible truth. Every victory leaves ghosts behind. Good Morning Vietnam, 1987. A comedy set in a war zone should not work this well. And that is exactly why Good Morning Vietnam still feels so sharp. Robin Williams plays Adrian Cronauer, an armed forces radio DJ sent to Saigon, where his wild humor, rapid-fire impressions, and rebellious energy collide with military censorship. At first, the film feels almost light, carried by Williams' explosive comic timing and the strange absurdity of trying to entertain soldiers surrounded by danger. But slowly, the laughter begins to crack. The jokes are not just jokes. They are survival tools. Cronauer becomes a voice of sanity in a place where official reports are polished, truth is filtered, and young men are being told to stay cheerful while the world around them burns. The film's genius is in that emotional switch. It pulls viewers in with comedy, then quietly reveals the sadness underneath. Saigon is vibrant, chaotic, and tense, and Cronauer's friendship with Vietnamese locals gives the story a deeper political and human edge. Good Morning. Vietnam is not the bloodiest film on this list, but it understands something many war movies miss. Morale can be manipulated, truth can be censored, and sometimes the funniest man in the room is the one who sees the tragedy most clearly. Born on the 4th of July, 1989. The most painful Vietnam War stories do not always end on the battlefield. Sometimes they begin when the soldier comes home. Born on the 4th of July follows Ron Kovich, a young American raised on patriotism, pride, and the belief that serving his country would give his life meaning. At first, he represents the dream sold to an entire generation: honor, duty, sacrifice, and glory. But Vietnam shatters that dream with brutal force. After being paralyzed in combat, Kovich returns to a country that does not know how to face him, comfort him, or even admit what the war has done. Tom Cruise gives one of his most intense performances, turning Kovich's journey into a raw portrait of physical pain, emotional rage, and political awakening. Oliver Stone does not make this a simple anti-war lecture. He makes it personal. The film shows how a man can love his country deeply and still feel betrayed by it. That contradiction is what gives the movie its fire. It is not just about Vietnam. It is about the cost of believing too completely in a story that later breaks your body and spirit. Born on the 4th of July earns its place because it shows the war after the guns stop, when the real battle becomes memory, guilt, disability, and the courage to speak against the myth. The Deer Hunter, 1978. Before the war takes them, The Deer Hunter makes you sit with the men as ordinary people, and that is what makes the damage feel unbearable. The film begins far from the jungles of Vietnam, in a Pennsylvania steel town where friends drink, hunt, celebrate weddings, and live inside a tight, working-class world. Then, the war arrives, not as adventure, but as a rupture that tears through everything familiar. Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, and John Savage carry the emotional weight of men changed in ways no one back home can fully understand. The film is famous for its disturbing Russian roulette sequences, which have been debated for historical accuracy, but as cinema, they operate like a nightmare symbol of Vietnam itself: chance, terror, helplessness, and psychological destruction. What makes The Deer Hunter so powerful is not only what happens overseas, but what happens after. Home is still there, but the men are not the same men who left it. Friendship becomes haunted. Silence becomes heavy. Even survival feels damaged. This is not a traditional combat movie, and that is exactly why it stands apart. It captures the emotional fallout of war as something that spreads through families, towns, and memories. The Deer Hunter is slow, painful, and devastating, but its sadness is the point. It shows that some wars do not end when soldiers return. They follow them home. Full Metal Jacket, 1987. Some war films show soldiers being broken by combat. Full Metal Jacket shows them being broken before they even reach the war. Stanley Kubrick divides the film into two unforgettable halves, and that structure is part of its genius. The first half takes place in Marine boot camp, where young men are stripped of softness, individuality, and emotional safety under the brutal command of Gunnery Sergeant Hartman. R. Lee Ermey's performance is terrifying because it feels less like acting and more like institutional pressure given a human voice. The tragedy of Private Pyle becomes the film's first warning. The machinery of war does not simply train men to survive, it can also deform them. Then the movie shifts to Vietnam during the Tet Offensive, following Joker through a world of urban combat, absurd military language, and emotional detachment. Kubrick's style is cold, sharp, and unsettling. He does not beg the audience to cry. He makes them watch how violence becomes routine, how humor becomes armor, and how morality becomes harder to locate. Full Metal Jacket is one of the most quoted Vietnam films ever made, but beneath the famous lines is a deeply uncomfortable idea. War does not only happen in battle. It begins in language, training, obedience, and the slow destruction of empathy. That is why the film still feels dangerous. It laughs like a machine, then leaves blood on the floor. Apocalypse Now, 1979. No Vietnam War movie feels more like a fever dream than Apocalypse Now, and that is why it refuses to age like a normal film. Francis Ford Coppola does not simply tell a war story. He drags the viewer into madness by boat, mile by mile, deeper into a conflict that begins to feel less like history and more like the collapse of civilization. Martin Sheen plays Captain Willard, sent on a secret mission into Cambodia to assassinate Colonel Kurtz, a brilliant special forces officer who has built his own terrifying kingdom in the jungle. The journey is hypnotic, violent, strange, and morally rotten. Helicopters attack to Wagner. Soldiers surf near battle zones. Commanders speak with confidence while everything around them looks insane. Marlon Brando's Kurtz appears like the final face of the war's darkness, intelligent, broken, monstrous, and strangely calm. What makes Apocalypse Now so legendary is that it understands Vietnam as more than a military disaster. It becomes a psychological descent, a vision of power without restraint, and a warning about what happens when empires lose their soul. It may not be the most realistic Vietnam film in a traditional sense, but emotionally, it captures something terrifyingly true. War here is not organized chaos. It is chaos pretending to be organized. Apocalypse Now is cinema as nightmare, beautiful, horrifying, and almost impossible to shake. Platoon, 1986. The greatest Vietnam War movie does not need surreal symbols or grand speeches. It needs mud, fear, guilt, and the terrible feeling that the enemy may be everywhere, including inside your own unit. Platoon stands at number 1 because Oliver Stone brought something to it that most filmmakers could only imitate: lived experience. As a Vietnam veteran, Stone understood the confusion of the jungle, the exhaustion of young soldiers, and the moral pressure that could turn men against each other. Charlie Sheen plays Chris Taylor, a new recruit who arrives with idealism and slowly watches it collapse. The film's real war is not only between American soldiers and the Viet Cong. It is between two visions of survival, represented by Willem Dafoe's Sergeant Elias and Tom Berenger's Sergeant Barnes. Elias carries a wounded sense of humanity. Barnes represents brutality hardened into command. Taylor is trapped between them, and that conflict gives the movie its soul. Platoon does not romanticize combat. It shows boredom, panic, drugs, resentment, racial tension, civilian tragedy, and the emotional numbness that grows when men are pushed beyond themselves. The famous images are powerful, but the film's lasting impact comes from its honesty. It feels dirty, chaotic, and spiritually bruised. That is why it remains the strongest Vietnam War film ever made. Platoon does not just show the war, it makes the viewer feel how a young man's soul can become another casualty. Vietnam War movies are not just stories about bullets, jungles, and soldiers. They are stories about memory, guilt, survival, and the price of believing too late that war changes everyone it touches. Some films on this list are brutal, some are emotional, and some are still controversial. But the real question is simple. Which one hit you hardest?